Hare Krishna. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देशतारिणे जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवास आदि गौर भक्त वृंदा हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे ओम ज्ञानतिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत् नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवतीरुत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्ठिकी हरे कृष्ण हरे कृष्ण everybody. So we're reading from the 7th canto, the Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 12, entitled The Perfect Society for Spiritual Classes. And today we are reading from text 11. So I'll read the verses a couple of times, and then the devotees can chant after that. Etat sarvam gruhasthasya samam natam yaterapi Kuru vrittir vikalpena gurhastasya artugaminaha etat sarvam gurhasthasya samamnatam yaterapi guru vrittir vikalpena gurhastasya artugaminaha etat sarvam gurhastasya samamnatam yaterapi guru vrittir vikalpena gruvastasya tugaminaha. The devotees can chant.
Etat sarvam grahastasya samam natam yater api guru vritir vikalpena grihastasyartuga minaha.
Anyone else? Okay. I will read the word for word translation. Etat, this, sarvam, all, grihastasya, of a householder, samamnatam, described, yati api, even of a person in the renounced order. So yati means sannyasi. Remember that famous verse, Naam Vipro, then that comes in Yatirva. Yati means sannyasi or renounced order. Yatir api. Guru vritti vikalpena. To follow the orders of the spiritual master. Grahastasya, of the householder. Rutu gaminaha, accepting sex only during the period favorable for procreation. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. All the rules and regulations apply equally to the householder and the sannyasi, the member of the renounced order of life. The grahastha, however, is given permission by the spiritual master to indulge in sex during the period favorable for procreation. Reported by Srila Prabhupada. It is sometimes misunderstood that a grihastha, a householder, is permitted to indulge in sex at any time. This is a wrong conception of grihastha life. In the spiritual life, whether one is a grihastha, vanaprastha, sannyasi, or brahmachari, everyone is under the control of the spiritual master. For brahmacharis and sannyasis, there are strong restrictions on sex indulgence. Similarly, there are strong restrictions for grihasthas. Grihastha should indulge in sex life only in accordance with the order of the guru. Therefore, it is mentioned here that one must follow the rules of the spiritual master. Guru vritti vikalpena. When the spiritual master orders, the grihastha may accept sex life. This is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita 7.11. Dharma viruddho bhuteshu kamosmi. Indulgence in sex life without disobedience to the religious rules and regulations constitutes a religious principle. The grihastha is allowed to indulge in sex life during the period favorable for procreation and in accordance with the spiritual master's order. The spiritual master's order allow a grihastha to engage in sex life at a particular time, then the grihastha may do so. Otherwise, if the spiritual master orders against it, the grihastha should abstain. The grihastha must obtain permission from the spiritual master to observe the ritualistic ceremony of garbhadhana samskara. Then he may approach his wife to beget children, otherwise not. A brahmana generally remains a brahmachari throughout his entire life, but although some brahmanas become grihasthas and indulge in sex life, they do so under the complete control of the spiritual master. The kshatriya is allowed to marry more than one wife, but this also must be in accordance with the instructions of the spiritual master. It is not that because one is a grihastha, he may marry as many times as he like and indulge in sex life as he likes. This is not spiritual life. In spiritual life, one must conduct one's whole life under the guidance of the guru. Only one who executes the spiritual life under the direction of the spiritual master can achieve the mercy of Krishna. Yasya prasadat bhagavat prasado. If one desires to advance in spiritual life, but he acts whimsically, not following the orders of the spiritual master, he has no shelter. Yasya aprasadan nagati kutopi. Without the spiritual master's order, even the grihastha should not indulge in sex life. So I'll read the purport as a translation again for context. All the rules and regulations apply equally to the householder and the sannyasi. The member of the renounced order of life. The grihastha, however, is given permission by the spiritual master to indulge in sex during the period favorable for procreation. So this chapter I was discussing previously as well is part of this whole section where the discussion is happening on the topic of varnashrama. So the previous chapter was focused on the varnas. Varna, literally in Sanskrit, the word varna means color. So Krishna varnam tosha krishnam. This color is not blackish, not black. So varna literally means color, but also means hue, which then gives the connotation of the modes of nature. So as you know, Srila Prabhupada writes in many places also the different colors constitute the different modes of nature. And so the modes direct a person in a certain varna. Those who are in the mode of goodness completely are considered to have brahmanical qualities. Those who are mixed in the mode of goodness and passion are considered to be having kshatriya qualities. And those who are mixed in the mode of passion and also some ignorance are in the Vaishya qualities, and those who are mixed in passion and ignorance with more ignorance and less passion are in the Shudra category. So these are all described in various literatures. So this is all discussed, and that's discussed in great detail also in the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. And Srila Prabhupada gives extensive commentaries in the 11th canto as well. And this chapter 12 talks about the four ashramas. And so, although the verse specifically talks about, Srila Prabhupada, the verse specifically talks about sex life specifically as a point of discussion for the grihasthas, the point that is being made is a broader one. The point that's being made is the broader one. And I'll specifically focus on the broader point, and then we can speak specifically about the points made in this text as well. But the broader point is that the Varnashrama system, so now we're talking about the ashramas. The word ashrama literally in Sanskrit means a place where one can get shelter. So all of you know the word ashraya. The 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, which describes the sweet pastimes of Lord Sri Krishna, is considered the lotus face of the Lord. So the various cantos of Srimad Bhagavatam are loosely described as various limbs of the Lord. But specifically the 10th canto, which is the pastimes of Krishna directly, is considered the lotus face of the Lord. And so it's also called Ashraya. So in the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the discussion on the 10 topics of Srimad Bhagavatam. Atra sarga visargascha sthanam poshanam utayah manmantaro ishanugatha nirodha muktir ashraya. So I'm not going to go into the 10 topics of Srimad Bhagavatam. We can probably discuss it another time. But the point is, the sarga, primary creation, secondary creation, and so on. Ultimately, ashraya, samam bonam. Srila Prabhupada translates ashraya as samam bonam. But the literal translation of ashraya means shelter. And ashrama is a situation which gives us shelter. And the supreme shelter is the lotus feet of Lord Sri Krishna. The lotus feet of Sri Radhamodar is our supreme shelter. As servitors of Sri Radhamodar, we are all servitors of Sri Radhamodar. Our supreme shelter is at the lotus feet of Sri Radhamodar. So, no matter what ashrama we are in, we can say, I'm in a sannyasa ashram, I'm in a grahastha ashram, I'm in a vanaprastha ashram, I'm in a brahmacharya ashram. So we may be in different ashramas, but end of the day, that ashrama situation has to provide a shelter at the lotus feet of Sri Radhamodar. So just because you are in a situation where you may be single, or you may not be single, or you may be married, or you may be retired, that doesn't constitute that you're in an ashrama. What constitutes if you're an ashrama or not is, are you having the shelter of Sri Radhamodar or not? Are you actively, at every step of the way, every step in your life, taking active shelter of the supreme source of all shelter? That is the fundamental point. So if one does not take shelter in no matter what situation you're in of the Supreme Personality of Godhead through the instructions of the Guru, because we cannot directly approach Krishna. By the mercy of Krishna, we get Guru, and by the mercy of Guru, we get Krishna. Srila Prabhupada says in the purport, Yasya prasadat bhagavat prasado, yasya aprasadat nagati kutopi. We sing it every morning, but we sometimes don't actually meditate on the purport of what's being said. The Srila Prabhupada very strongly emphasizes that even Grahastha's actions, including procreating and so on, are dependent on the instructions of the spiritual master. And while Srila Prabhupada focuses on the act of when you indulge in sex or not, the broader point is engaging senses. So when we engage our senses in different ways, whether grossly in the most grossest form of sense gratification, which is sex life, or subtle sense gratification or other types of sense gratification, if it is without the authority of Guru Sadhu Shastra, and specifically with the blessings of the spiritual master, then you're falling apart in terms of your spiritual life. So this concept of ashraya is such a critical aspect of devotional service that we have to feel we're actively taking shelter. Now, it is not a passive thing, right? So sometimes people think that it is the job of the institution or the job of the whatever authorities to actually give us the shelter. We just have to hang in. It's like, you buy a plane ticket to go from, say, Harrisburg to Chicago. All you need to do is buy a plane ticket, sit on the plane, and you don't have to do anything. Once you sit on the plane, sit on your assigned seat, and don't create any ruckus on the plane. You don't actually punch the fellow passenger or something like that. You don't create any situation where you're being carted off from the plane by the police, right? If you just sit quietly and do nothing, The pilot will take you to your destination. The plane will take you to your destination. The airline that you've paid the ticket to will take you to your destination. You don't have to separately endeavor in any way. Right? So we feel that our spiritual life also becomes like that. Although Srila Prabhupada says that in many places, he also says that it depends on our endeavor, our enthusiasm, our desire for Krishna. Just because we are card-carrying members of a spiritual movement, Srila Prabhupada says that, just accept Krishna and then you will go back to Godhead. But there are many details as part of that process. It's not like there's some automatic process. We have to actually want it. We have free will. We have to surrender our free will to Krishna and actually follow the instructions of the spiritual master. We have to want to serve Shri Radha Mother. Krishna's mercy is always there. The spiritual master's instructions are always there. But the aspect of our surrender, meaning following the instructions, surrender doesn't mean that it's not a passive thing. It's a very active thing. Are we daily, minute by minute, hour by hour, actually considering our actions to be desiring Krishna? That becomes a very key thing. That becomes a very important thing. So in this verse, Srila Prabhupada talks about this. He says that this idea that we must follow the instructions of the spiritual master. And in the sixth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhyana Yoga section, in text 17, Krishna says, Yuktahara viharasya, Yukta cheshtasya karmasu, Yukta swapnova bodhasya, yogo bhavati dukkha. He who is regulated in his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practice of the yoga system. So the yoga system is also practiced under the shelter of the spiritual master. The shelter of the guru is important for us to practice the yoga system as well. So the key message from the practice of Varnashrama is that Varnashrama should be an active pursuit for us to seek shelter. When we seek shelter, we work under the guidance of those who are giving us shelter, which is our spiritual master and ultimately Shri Radha Mother. And our desire to serve, our desire to actively serve. Right? So this point is such a key point in my mind as well when I think about it, that Srila Prabhupada, whenever he sees the word karma yoga and he translates it, he always translates it as devotional service. Whenever the word bhakti comes, Srila Prabhupada always translates it as devotional service. And devotional service, the word service is integral to that phrase, devotional service. It's not a passive activity. It's an active activity. That's a oxymoron. But the point is, it's something we actively must seek and do. Manasa vacha karmana. The description is there of Ambarish Maharaj. Manasa means by mind. Manmana, think of Krishna. Vacha, by words, glorifying Krishna. Bodhyanta parasparam. So glorifying Krishna ourselves and also glorifying Krishna to others. And karmana, by our actions, the best extent possible. Some of us may be physically very able to do so many things. And as we get older, our abilities to do so many things physically goes away. But still our ability to do things mentally and by words may still be there. So we do the best we can in terms of, are we able to think positively about how we can help Krishna consciousness movement, Srila Prabhupada's movement? That's our responsibility. And similarly, by thoughts, by words, contemplate on how we can continue to expand Lord Chaitanya's movement. That's our responsibility. It's not sufficient for us to simply say, Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. So it's not sufficient for us to glorify Srila Prabhupada by chanting his pranam mantra. We should do that. But it's also a responsibility to make him Paschatya Deshatarine in any way we can. Right? So that is the point that I think about when I think about what Srila Prabhupada's instructions are. And so this staying in this ashram, grihastha ashram, many of us are grihasthas, we have this fundamental responsibility because Srila Prabhupada, and there are so many writings of Srila Prabhupada that we can cite. Srila Prabhupada said, the need of the hour is that we want to expand our movement. There are more and more people living in the temple. But there will be a time, Srila Prabhupada writes, that a majority of our members will be living outside as grihasthas and then participating in expanding the temple. Srila Prabhupada envisioned this. It's not like something that is an anomaly or something that's happening now, which shouldn't happen. Srila Prabhupada envisioned this. Any successful, mature society, religious society, there will be a class of people who are dedicated, full-time residents of the temple, but there will be a bigger class of people around that temple, around that spiritual community, to be part of the spiritual community, who are grihasthas, who are living exemplary lives and also contributing very, very positively by mind, words, and actions to the growth of the spiritual community. That becomes fundamental to a responsibility of a grihastha. And here, in the specific verse, it is said that the responsibilities of the grihasthas are not that different from a sannyasi, other than the fact that grihastha has a family. But in terms of your nishtha or your being fixed in Krishna consciousness, it's not like a sannyasi should be fixed in Krishna consciousness and a grihastha can be frivolous. That is not the point. This verse very specifically says that the focus, responsibility for grihastha is no different. And the Srimad Bhagavatam is full of these examples. There are so many examples in the Srimad Bhagavatam where it's not that only the sannyasis were devotees of the Lord and the grihasthas were just frivolous. On the contrary, it was completely replete with examples. Whether it's Lord Krishna himself in his exemplary way, how he lived in Dwarka, or the residents of Rajabhumi, starting with Nanda Maharaj, Vasudev Devaki, and so many other devotees across the Srimad Bhagavatam, replete with examples of grihasthas who lived exemplary lives under the shelter of the spiritual master, acting fully in that shelter and striving to live their lives in accordance with the instructions of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. Now, the one point that I'll be remiss if I don't mention is that a lot of times when devotees read these verses, they focus on the know this, know that, know this, know that, which is important because it's part of the discipline of spiritual life. But there's a lot more to it than that. Because if we just simply focus on the know, then we risk becoming Mayavadis. Now, this is a big leap statement, so I'll explain what I mean. So the whole idea of this Jnana Yogi and Mayavadi really begins with this concept of neti, 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 not this, not this, not this. So the focus is simply negating. Then we get so caught up in the negation that we forget what we should do. What is a positive engagement? So the positive engagement is Krishna consciousness. We should think of Krishna. We should, the very basic rule, right? The Srila Prabhupada used to quote all the time. He used to speak about this. He used to say, Smartavyo satatam Vishnu, vismartavyo jatuchit. Sarva vidhi nishedasyu, etayor eva kinkaraha. This is in, I forget which Puran it is. It's either Padma Puran or one of these Puranas. The specific verse that says, the goal of spiritual life is to always remember Krishna and never forget Krishna. And every other rule and regulation that's in the Shastra are subservient to these two rules, that always remember Krishna, never forget Krishna. So the positive aspect of, well, we understand we shouldn't do this and we shouldn't do that, we shouldn't do the other thing. But what should we do is we should become proactively engaged in glorifying Sri Krishna. And this activity of glorifying Krishna has to be done joyfully. This activity of devotional service has to be done joyfully. And especially as grihasthas, we have a huge responsibility to live our lives in a way that is exemplary. to be exemplary in our Krishna consciousness, that everybody who looks at us, because the reality is, majority of the world is going to be grihasthas. You will have brahmacharis who will then eventually, many of them will become grihasthas. Few brahmacharis, as Srila Prabhupada says, may decide not to become grihasthas and continue as Naishtika brahmacharis and become sannyasis. Then there are vanaprasthis who are either by virtue of just spiritual maturity or just age become vanaprasthis. And then a portion of that becomes sannyasis. So I cannot assign a specific percentage, but I would say if you look at society at large, majority, more than 70%, probably 80% people even, will eventually at some point in their life be grihasthas. So grihasthas are a vast majority of the population. Even in a cultured spiritual society, majority of the people will be grihasthas. So this grihastha ashram is such a huge pillar of any spiritual movement that if the grihasthas are not properly trained and they don't pursue Krishna consciousness in a enthusiastic and joyful manner, it becomes very difficult to sustain any spiritual society. Because you can have the inspiration and you can have the study or brahmachari perspective, but if the grihastha population is not joyfully performing Krishna consciousness service, not joyfully engaging in seva, then everything else becomes, maybe it's just words. Think about a situation where somebody comes to a temple and we have a t-shirt on saying, chant Hare Krishna and be happy, and we're just so morose. And people look at us and say, you say chant Hare Krishna and be happy, but why are you so miserable? So we have to think about that. So and we can't pretend to be happy if you're not. So the idea is to really pursue the act of seva in a very, very grateful way, that we're grateful to have the opportunity to perform seva. There's a very beautiful bhajan that recently my godbrother Gaurvani, he sang that bhajan in a recording. And it's a Hindi bhajan. It goes something like this: Krishna kripa ho tabhi Krishna ka naam le sakoge, which means that only if you have Krishna's mercy can you chant Krishna's name. And if you've chanted Krishna's name, then we should realize that we've gotten Krishna kripa. So all of us have chanted Krishna's name many, many times. We chant around and so on. So we should all realize that we have been given Krishna kripa. Now the question is, what are we doing with it? So receiving Krishna kripa is one thing, but the question I would like to meditate on myself. I'm not going to be audacious enough to say we should all meditate on it, but at least I'm going to meditate on myself that I chanted my rounds today, 16 rounds. So the fact that I chanted Krishna's names means that I've received Krishna's mercy at some level through my spiritual master. So the question I have to ask myself is, so what are you doing about it? Ananda Vilas Das, what are you doing about it? You received Krishna's mercy, what are you doing about it? And if we waste that mercy, then it's nobody else's fault than our own. So this grihastha ashrama, and I'm saying this point very specifically because I see most of the devotees on the call also are grihastha ashrama, that it's our responsibility to pursue Krishna consciousness with the most enthusiasm, perform seva with the most enthusiasm, and we can dedicate our lives to follow the instructions of the spiritual master to a point where we become ideal grihasthas. Because if you're not ideal grihasthas, it's going to become very difficult to become ideal vanaprasthas or anything else. So that's the few things I wanted to say on this verse. Anyway, if there are any questions or comments, we can discuss for a few minutes now. I just wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions, comments, or anybody would like to correct anything that I said. Thank you. Hare Krishna. No questions or comments?
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Thank you very much for a wonderful class.
Thank you.
I appreciate your particular angle on this. As you pointed out, I think a lot of other devotees would have gone in a very different direction. I appreciate the and increased perspective of um, your ideas on this. Um, I'm thinking a lot about the point Srila Prabhupada is making here about complete submission to the spiritual master. That even for a householder, even the most intimate aspects of his life are under the control, or should be under the control, of the spiritual master. So it underscores the fact that the order of the spiritual master is extremely important. It's of paramount importance to the disciple. And this for me, this is actually triggering for me because I think a lot about my spiritual master and his instructions, and after many years of cultivation, I have come to feel a strong obligation, a sense of duty, and understanding, my best understanding, and I'm completely prepared to acknowledge that my understanding is faulty, and in fact, I find from time to time that I discover that I'm wrong about something. I hear a lecture of Srila Prabhupada in a way that didn't somehow um, uh, click for me in the past, and I suddenly realize, my gosh, I've been misunderstanding this point for so many years. And then I hear Srila Prabhupada clarify it, and I realize, I had actually gotten it wrong. So, I've learned, to listen and to try to keep an open mind. Um, but I'm also passionate about the things that I think I understand. I will try to defend Srila Prabhupada's interests when and I have a particular conception of what I believe that is. Um, but as I say, I may be wrong. So my issue is that I sometimes find that I need to back up a little bit. Devotees have different perspectives, which is normal and not a bad thing. Krishna consciousness is vast. Krishna himself is, a limitlessly faceted jewel. There are innumerable angles. We all have different angles of vision. We appreciate different aspects. We see different things. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this one particular issue. Sometimes the spiritual master may give an instruction which seems to be impractical, or it may seem as though now is not the time for that. Or sometimes the instruction may appear to completely defy our own perception. And I'm thinking of one particular example that Srila Prabhupada gave, that the spiritual master and the disciple are walking along a path, and they encounter a rope lying on the pathway. The spiritual master says to the disciple, "It's a rope, pick it up." And the disciple looks and he sees that it's a snake. Or the reverse, um, the spiritual master says, "It's a snake, put it down." And the disciple in his perception, he's seeing that, no, it's not a snake, it's a rope. And so what to do in such a circumstance when, and I'm really thinking particularly about that's an extreme example, but I'm thinking especially about an instance in which perhaps the instruction of the spiritual master seems impractical.
Yep.
And some devotees will reason that, well, we should do what makes sense. We should do what seems practical. Another devotee might say we should follow the order of the spiritual master, regardless of whether it's practical or impractical. Our duty is, not to overthink it, but just, whatever the spiritual master orders, we simply do that or try to do that. And that's success. It doesn't matter whether we actually succeed or not. We try for success, but we just simply follow the order of the spiritual master. And this is a real thing. It's playing out every day. Even here at Gita Nagari, there some devotees have a conception of how Srila Prabhupada has instructed us to develop Gita Nagari. Others feel this or that is not practical to try to implement, or at least not at this time, and they choose to go in another direction. I'm curious to know what your understanding is of the actual duty of a disciple with regards to the order of the spiritual master. To what extent?
Wonderful question. Thank you, Prabhuji, for asking the question. And I'll say one thing first, and I'll answer your specific question. That those of you, Prabhuji, you've had personal association with Prabhupada, and I've only read his purports and instructions and heard his lectures and so on. And I've heard this from many disciples of Srila Prabhupada as well, that if anybody thinks Srila Prabhupada was one-dimensional, you're completely misunderstanding Prabhupada. So Srila Prabhupada was so far-sighted, and he was also so magnanimous and broad-minded. Srila Prabhupada was incredibly broad-minded, and he understood time, place, and circumstance. And there are very specific purports, and if you're interested, I can point to them separately. But Srila Prabhupada talks about how we should preach in various countries and regions based on time, place, and circumstance. The principles cannot be compromised. It's not like you suddenly say, okay, you know what, we don't have to chant Krishna's names anymore, or we can ignore the no meat eating. That's not the point. Principles are not compromised, but you still present Krishna consciousness in a way that appeals to the audience. When Srila Prabhupada presented Krishna consciousness when he came to America, he used the example of car and driver. Now, Rupa Goswami does not use the car and driver example, but that's not a deviation from the principles of Krishna consciousness. That is presenting Krishna consciousness in a way that that assimilates the current situation and what people will grasp. Srila Prabhupada spoke about moon landing. He spoke about so many things, but those are not Shastric points specifically, but more how do you speak Krishna consciousness in a way that makes us. Srila Prabhupada was incredibly broad-minded, and he did not expect us to not use our brain. That comes out over and over again in Srila Prabhupada's purports in many places. He doesn't want us to be robots. Krishna has not made us into robots. Krishna has not made us into mindless living entities with no free will. If Krishna has given us free will, Srila Prabhupada, as the Acharya, the founder Acharya, honors that free will too. He understands that we have free will. And so Srila Prabhupada says in one of the purports in the Bhagavad Gita, the second chapter itself, that there is no room for blind following or absurd inquiry. They're both condemned. I forget specifically which verse, and I can point it out, but he says there is no room for blind following or absurd inquiry. So the expectation is not that we'll blindly follow, nor is the expectation that we will have absurd inquiries just to simply procrastinate or disobey orders. That's the first point. The second point is that when the spiritual master gives instruction, the instructions come in different categories. The first set of instructions come in the category of general instructions that are given in a class, or let's say we read a recording of Srila Prabhupada or a transcript of a morning walk, and he may have said something. Those are general comments. Now, those comments are very specific to time, place, and circumstance. It may be specifically for one person based on that person's circumstance and so on. But they're not supposed to be intended to be taken as general principles that always have to be followed, absolutely no questions asked. Because that was something that was said to that particular circumstance or situation. Then there are instructions of the spiritual master which are based on Shastra, which are specifically how we should cultivate our Krishna conscious practice. What Srila Prabhupada talks about sincerely chanting 16 rounds, serving devotees, developing the sense of humility. These are all not like suggestions. When Rupa Goswami speaks about very specific things, that the 6 things that help our Krishna consciousness, these are not general suggestions that we may follow or ignore. These are very specific things that we as practicing devotees must cultivate. But the acharyas, including Srila Prabhupada, are very, very conscious and aware that each of us have different capacities and capabilities. That's just the way each of us is. Our ability and capacity to follow the instruction varies. And so the spiritual master gives these philosophical points and these general instructions, set the gold standard. And then when the spiritual master gives a direct order to us personally, then that's not a suggestion. That's not a general point. And that becomes a very specific thing that the spiritual master, out of his causeless mercy and personal relationship, knowing our situation, knowing our circumstance, gives us a very specific order. Like when Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada, he spoke so many lectures, and Srila Prabhupada was in the audience. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said so many things. But one time, when they were walking around Radhakunda, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said, if you ever get money, print books. That was a very specific instruction of Srila Prabhupada. Very specific instruction of Srila Prabhupada is, you are an educated young man, you should take the message of Lord Chaitanya to the West. That was a very specific instruction. Srila Prabhupada saw that as a very specific instruction to him. Understanding his personal situation as an educated young man who had the ability to preach Krishna consciousness in the West. Srila Prabhupada, as a writer who could write so many beautiful articles that were published, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, when he read that article, that poem that was presented to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati for his birthday, he said, whatever this young man writes, publish it. That's a very specific order. So if the editor of that magazine, next time that person gets a Srila Prabhupada article, Abhay Charan Day at that time, and if he refused to publish it, whimsically, that's a direct disobeying of the spiritual master's order. So we have to use our intelligence to understand what's a specific direct order versus what is a general instruction that we should strive to get to, versus what is a point that was made based on time, place, and circumstances, right? I'll give you one example too. There was a scenario where one time there was a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. I think the names were obscure, so it's not clear who that person is, but this person was not interested in continuing with his marriage. So he wanted to divorce his wife and marry somebody else, something like that. So he asked Srila Prabhupada once or twice, and Srila Prabhupada said, absolutely not, that's not our system. This is not a method to do that. And finally, when the person asked Srila Prabhupada for the 3rd time, saying, I really seek your blessings to divorce my wife, it's not working out, I want to marry somebody else. And Srila Prabhupada said, okay. So the devotees asked Srila Prabhupada, so this is contrary to your instructions. And Srila Prabhupada said that this person had already made up his mind to do this. So if I said, no, you shall not do it, he would have still done it. And that situation would have created an offense of disobeying the spiritual master's direct order. which would have destroyed his spiritual life. Because he had already made up his mind to do it, I agree, not because I think that's the right thing to do, because Srila Prabhupada didn't say all of this, but that's the point, that he was concerned about the devotee's disciple's life and a spiritual life, that he said, okay, because this person had already made up his mind. He was going to do it no matter what Srila Prabhupada said, but he still, out of courtesy or whatever, asked the question. Srila Prabhupada agreed. But the purpose of agreeing was to avoid a scenario where this person did it anyway and then was implicated in directly disobeying spiritual master's order. And that's the first aparadha to the holy name, the offense to the holy name, disregarding the orders of spiritual master. So there are always circumstances that exist in all these scenarios. So if one were to just take that scenario where Srila Prabhupada was asked by somebody, hey, I want to divorce my spouse, and Srila Prabhupada said yes, then one could take that and say, well, that's the general instruction, that there's no problem, you can do that, you don't have to think about it. But that's not what Srila Prabhupada is saying. Srila Prabhupada made a very specific decision, which was circumstantial to that particular devotee. So when we understand the orders of spiritual master, we have to have the maturity to understand what is the specific order that we are specifically required to follow, and what are the standards that we are required to aspire to achieve. Now, Srila Prabhupada says at the age of 50, one should leave home and go to the forest and become vanaprastha. Now, some of us may be over 50. And so have we disobeyed Srila Prabhupada's order? No, that's a general point that, yeah, at some point in your life, and 50, you can decide it's 50, 55, whatever, you should start getting yourself disconnected from family entanglements. That's a general point. It's not a very specific that, hey, you are 49 years and 364 days. Now it's 365 days, 366, you now 50 years and 1 day old. You immediately have to leave your family, else you are disobeying Srila Prabhupada's order. That's not the point. So some points are more philosophical, that we understand what the intent is, the principle we have to understand. In some cases, it's the Shastri point. In some cases, the very specific direct order. In that case, it's not open for interpretation. It's not for us to say, when Srila Prabhupada, when we take a vow in front of our spiritual master that we will chant 16 rounds of the Hare Krishna mantra every day, that's not a general point that's open to interpretation. It's not that we can decide, well, I said 16 rounds, but it could also mean 8 rounds or 1 round, whatever, or no rounds. No, then you directly disobeying your spiritual master. So again, I'm not giving you a cut and dry answer, because as Krishna has given us free will, we have to use our intelligence. Srila Prabhupada expected us to use our intelligence. And Thakur Prabhuji, if you think I'm missing the point, please correct me. But this is my understanding after reading Srila Prabhupada's purports thoroughly and understanding what he meant in terms of when he said there's no room for blind following or absurd inquiry. We have to inquire submissively, but with the intention of understanding. But at the same time, not blindly follow without understanding. I'm not sure if it answered your question, but that's at least how I thought about this point.
You have shed a lot of light on the topic. There's a lot to discuss in this connection. We could go on for some time, but I greatly appreciate your comments. I'm still thinking about some specific circumstances, and it's challenging. Sometimes trying to understand, even with our best intelligence, applied to our best capacity, sometimes it's difficult to understand what to do, what not to do, and devotees sometimes will have differing opinions. One devotee, his best intelligence tells him he should do this. Another devotee thinks it through to his best capacity and comes to a different conclusion. That happens, and it's we're all individuals, and so we naturally have differences of opinion. It's not that we all necessarily will arrive at precisely the same conclusion. At Krishna consciousness is not a cookie cutter that, every devotee comes out a clone of another devotee, but we're always individuals, and we have differing perspectives. But there
This is
are
why
also,
sadhu sangha becomes so important. So that's because of this sadhu sangha and the association of having the shelter of senior Vaishnavas who can guide us become very critical. Because otherwise, this very nice point that was made, which was that the intelligence becomes a tool in the service of the false ego. So we can justify anything. Because if you've read sufficient amount of Srimad Bhagavatam, then you will find a verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam to justify any whimsical action you want to take. And I can prove it too. That if you whatever whimsical action you want to take, you will find some reference of in the Shastra which you can take out of context to justify your whimsical action. That's why it's not just Shastra Pramana. That's why we always talk about Guru Sadhu Shastra Pramana. For instance, there are verses in the Shastra that says that if you hear somebody blaspheme the Lord, you should immediately cut out their tongue. And if you're unable to do that, you should jump into the Ganges and end your life. This is an actual Shastric quote. Now, we see people blaspheming the Lord in so many situations. Are we to walk around with knives that we can cut out their tongues? Or should we commit mass suicide? What is the instruction for us? Then we look at Sadhu Praman. We look at Guru Praman. Do we see sadhus like Rupa Goswami and other previous acharyas walking around with knives, cutting out people's tongues? They never did that. And then do we see our spiritual master specifically telling us to do that? The answer is no. So then we understand that although that's the instruction in the Shastra, it is probably for a different place, different time, different circumstance. It's specifically not an instruction to us to walk around with knives in our pockets to be able to cut people's tongues out, which is why we always talk about Guru Sadhu Shastra Praman. It's not just one. And that's why we have to use our intelligence and the association of senior devotees who can give us guidance, who understand our situation. So this phrase that Lord Chaitanya used and it comes in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, but Lord Chaitanya said, you should associate with Swajatiya devotees. Swajatiya. Jati sometimes gets loosely translated as caste, but that's not the point that Lord Chaitanya is making. He's not saying that, hey, if you're a certain race or a certain region, let's say you come from a certain part of the United States, you should only associate with devotees from Pennsylvania. If you're a Pennsylvanian, or if you're white, you should only associate with white devotees. That is not what is being said. What is being said is that you should understand what your proclivities are, what your mood is, what your affinities are in the spiritual sense, not if you have random affinities, not like if you like to do random things, don't find other people who like to do random things because it'll just create chaos. But each person has a certain affinity in how they perform devotional service. Some people are into kirtan, some people are into Shastra studies, some people are into how deities can be decorated more beautifully, some people are into cooking or other kind of moods. Some people are very much into, like, they want to go to different holy places and traveling is the big thing. Some people like to stay in one place and do their bhajan. So each of us have our proclivities, our interests, our inclinations. So we associate with like-minded devotees. And then we associate with like-minded senior devotees who can guide us in a way that will work for our proclivity. So if you are a very introverted devotee who likes to just worship the deities and read Shastra and not really be too much in the spotlight, and if you take association and shelter from a senior devotee who's very much a boisterous preacher and very, very extroverted preacher, and that devotee gives you instruction that, no, you should become a world preacher and go on a world preaching tour, and that might not work for you. Because it's not a wrong instruction, but it doesn't apply to you because your personality is completely opposite. That's why it's important to understand what your proclivities are in Krishna consciousness and take shelter from senior devotees who have similar moods, who can give you instructions and interpretation of the words of the spiritual master that can help you in your proclivities in engaging in Krishna consciousness. And back to Varnashrama, it's not that only Brahmanas can become devotees of the Lord. So if you are actually a Kshatriya, then you should give up the Kshatriya mentality and go and become a Brahmana. Krishna never told Arjun that, hey, you're a Kshatriya, so the only way to become my devotee is to become a Brahmana, so you give up the Kshatriya mood and take to deity worship. No. Krishna told Arjun, Mam anusmara yudhya, think of me and fight. So engaging your proclivities of a Kshatriya in my service is bhakti. Which is why sometimes we have this question that, well, different people have different interpretations of the same instruction, which is why it's important to get shelter of senior devotees who can help us in our proclivities and help us progress in Krishna consciousness in the way that is anukula or aligned with our propensities, but favorable to Krishna consciousness. Anyway, like you said, Prabhuji, a lot more can be said. So I'll stop here. And unless there are any specific questions, additional questions, we can stop. Looks like that's it. So we will stop here. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu. Your comments on Guru, Shastra, Sadhu, and taking the guidance of senior devotees, in particular, these items fully addressed my question. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.